What's up, folks? Huge shout out to Kaden Gardner, the author of this series. He just released a webtoon video that's set in the same universe as this one. Make sure you go check it out and subscribe to his channel to show your support. Ophelia and I sat in Shaw's old office, where we watched the ship's security footage. Everything was chaotic. We needed answers, and the control room was a disaster. The next best thing was Shaw's computer. It wasn't like he was going to be using it. A lot happens in it. But let me follow the agent of the chaos, Mr. Morales. The footage starts with him in his bunk area. Shaw and Jones are arguing in the control room. Hector Morales opens his phone and looks at it. He's too far away from the camera to make out the text, but he sighs and looks at his feet. Then, he stands and walks out of the room. Hector Morales first walks into the medical bay, where the lightbender Grandmaster Nigel is laying in his bed. Hector leans against the doorframe with his hands in his pockets. Nigel smiles at him slightly.
I owe you a thanks, Grandmaster. Without you, none of this would have been possible.
I could see Nigel's face gain a hint of confusion. He couldn't speak real well, because his ribs had been caved in. Being a lightbender, he'd healed somewhat already, but he'd been set for transport and was supposed to leave about an hour after this video has been filmed.
Well, you and Keith, it wasn't easy. Masking Keith's powers, making sure he didn't even know he had them, building his trust, raising him. Having a lightbender, a Nephilim on my roof? Blah, it was fucking disgusting. But it served a purpose. It led you to my doorstep. The rest was easy.
Morales was standing over Nigel, who stared at him wide-eyed. I could see him reach for a button to call a nurse, but Morales swiped it away.
Do you think Raiden was at my office to kill me? He was there to make sure you didn't. To make sure that Keith's powers activated. All to pique your interest.
Morales produced an obsidian knife.
So, Grandmaster Nigel, thank you.
Morales said right as he jammed the knife into Nigel's throat. It was around then that something happened that shook the ship, almost like it had been hit by lightning. The power cut out for a moment. The camera feed went black. But when it came back on, Rashad was entering the room in a panic. He cried out. His Grandmaster was dead. He turned to sprint out of the room.
Help! Help!
He cried. Only he was cut off by Morales. Only Morales looked different now. His neck seemed a bit longer. Then his eyes looked almost reptilian.
What are you?
Asked Rashad.
You can call me Quetzalcoatl.
He sneered before shoving the blade into Rashad's throat. He then began making his way down another hallway, his body morphing fast. 1 second, it was Hector Morales. The next, it was a massive oily black serpent with brightly colored feathers around his neck. He made his way through the ship, devouring several guards along the way. At the brick, Carlos Estevez sat with his back against the wall. He looked unconcerned, even though alarms had begun going off all around the ship. His brother stood outside his cell, looking at a guard who was standing at a doorway that led out of the brick and into a hallway.
What was that?
Asked Juan.
I'm not sure. I've been trying to radio topside, but I'm not getting anything back.
A massive, feathered snake head suddenly dropped into frame and clamped down onto the guard's head. Juan quickly shut the door and stumbled backward. I watched as Hector morphed back into a more humanoid form and kicked the door in. Juan went for his pistol, but Hector moved in a blur, knocking him out before turning and looking at Carlos.
I had to change my whole plan for you and the girl.
Carlos Estevez stood up and smiled.
Oh, I feel special.
While Morales worked the prison break, there was another problem in another hallway on the ship. This one, Gideon security forces were gunning down sailors. Security forces that were led by a massive red-armored samurai. This thing had to have been 7, maybe 8 feet tall. He bashed sailors' heads in with his massive club, a club that seemed to charge itself with streaks of red and blue lightning that crackled between the metal grooves. But he wasn't the only person that caught my eye. Another of the mercenaries wore a trench coat and wielded 2 thin daggers. Half his face had been scorched by a recent explosion. It was Jackson, the same vampire that David Stone had given his life in an attempt to slay. But he wasn't even the one that shot a shiver of rage up my spine. That honor belonged to the lead mercenary. The red-headed, now super soldier that had taken my life. Jamie King stood there with a pistol aimed. The 3 and their mercs had carved a path of blood and bullets through the bowels of the ship as they made their way towards the control room. When they arrived, they found Shaw as he motioned for Grace and the preacher to get inside. Shaw was about to go in himself when he caught a thin dagger in the back of his leg. Shaw fell to the ground, but not before he got his hand on the scanner that caused the control room door to shut, leaving himself outside with the 3 assailants.
Shaw.
Jamie started.
You really shouldn't have done that.
Shaw had maneuvered himself to where he was sitting with his back against the wall. He looked up at Jamie. You're a real piece of shit, Jamie. You know that? Shaw said. Jamie only chuckled as he stood straight up and raised his pistol. He didn't say anything clever. He didn't say anything petty. He just blasted a hole in Shaw's forehead. The rest happened fast. Jackson kicked the steel door in that led to the control room, flying in a blur and throwing more knives into the closest analysts. One of the daggers hit Father Raphael in his eye. Grace screamed loudly before being hit by a bolt of lightning. I wasn't sure if she was dead or not. Jamie stood over her with Jackson and Raiden flanking him. I could see Jones cowering in one of the corners. Raiden, the rat samurai, picked Grace up and tossed her over his shoulder. The group linked up with Morales and Carlos outside the control room. That must have been around the time that Victor had finished with us, because that was when Victor himself appeared amongst the group. He smiled as he looked at Grace, then snapped his fingers. The whole group was suddenly just gone. I couldn't tell exactly how Ophelia felt about this whole thing. I could tell that she was shaken. I mean, how couldn't she be? We'd just gotten our ass kicked. But we hadn't lost. Not completely. Not yet. I think she knew this too. I gave her a slight squeeze on her shoulder before standing and walking out. Up top, I found Keith and Aisha. Aisha was kneeling over the body of Nigel. What happened? She asked. The Horseman had given them a briefing on the security footage. He'd seen it before he'd come and picked us up. I'm sure you're wondering where he and the other angels had been during this whole predicament. Well, they were in heaven, discussing which rules they'd be allowed to bend in order to apprehend Victor. Hector happened. He's not human, Keith said in a voice that sounded heartbroken and angry. Aisha turned and shot up into his face. I knew it! I knew you were— He didn't know, Horseman said sternly as he approached him. Morales masked himself with blood magic. I didn't even know his true self. I'm not sure how, but he's working with Victor. He has been this whole time. He used you, Keith. He knew what you were. He probably gave Simon the tip on his own safe. He knew Aisha would come for you, even at Raiden waiting. One clever line of dialogue later, and he's in. His whole mission, your whole life, was to take down the Eastern Lightbender Temple. Why? Asked Keith. The Horseman sighed. Because he's a god. I walked over to where the body bags were, where Shaw's body had been placed. I could hear Ophelia walking up behind me. I can remember thinking that Shaw somehow looked even more annoyed in death, that dying was simply an inconvenience to him. It sure had been to me. I also wondered if the Horseman could bring him back. After all, he was one of the best. Don't blame yourself. Jamie did this, I said as Ophelia stopped right next to me. I wasn't going to, she replied. Good. I could hear her inhale. This is probably a bad time, but I figure once the world may end soon, are we ever gonna talk? I looked at her. There was an eagerness to her, an eagerness and a hint of exhaustion. I took a deep breath. We will, once this is all over. That was when Jones approached us. He looked upset. I mean, we were all upset, but he seemed angry. They killed him like a fucking dog, he growled. Jamie did this. You knew what Gideon was capable of, I said. I never thought they'd openly attack a US military vessel. They did. What are you going to do about it? I asked. We took the next few hours to gather our bearings. The Horseman and I went over the security footage over and over again. We didn't find much. We did, however, find out that Father Raphael had somehow survived. The knife only took his eye. He'd been sent to a hospital on shore. We stood in the security room with Ophelia and Jones, trying hard to figure out our next move. We didn't have shit to go on, until Chad walked in with a massive smile on his face. She called me back, he announced. We all turned and looked at him. What did she say? I asked. After she finished chewing me out, she told me everything. So, Agent Terrell. Apparently he was working undercover for MI6, but we knew that already. Apparently, factions across the pond had been working the same case against Gideon that we were for several months. Terrell being their best agent, even after we compromised him, he managed to re-infiltrate Gideon's security forces. Now, he was embedded in with them, somehow managing to make contact with Chad's ex-wife. He knew where Victor was. He also knew where Victor had planned to test the weapon. Fucking Grozny. I exhaled. I explained this to, well, everyone. We'd already come up with the makings of a plan. As I stood there with my arms crossed, Aisha, Chad, Ophelia, Ray, Keith, and Miguel stood around me. I'll understand if you don't want to go. What we're facing is more dangerous than any of you could possibly imagine. I took a deep breath. In the past, I've said that you weren't the good guys. I wasn't trying to change the world. Just live in it. Then I died. The world doesn't need survivors. It never did. It just needs people to do the right thing. Some speech, I know, but I knew it wasn't going to take much convincing. Everyone there had lost something. Everyone there wanted a fight. Wanted revenge. But that wasn't important. Innocent lives were at stake. I'm in, Aisha said. Me too, added Chad. Same, but how are we going to fight Victor? We threw our biggest guns at him, and they didn't do shit. I smirked as the angels appeared in the sky behind me. We're gonna bring some bigger guns. Our plan was relatively simple. Chad's ex-wife was our in. We'd linked up with her in Grozny, and she would escort us to where Grace was being held. From there, we'd rescue her and destroy all traces of Lazarus in the building. We prepped on the flight deck. We had our whole team plus 3 APCs and a 12-man unit of Navy SEALs that Ophelia had worked with several times over the last few weeks. I didn't know their leader very well, just that he ironically went by the codename Angel. He seemed like a good dude. Jones was currently en route to a nearby base to see about getting us air support. While we prepped, I did notice as one of the angels, Rain, approached Keith. I was helping load weapons into an APC. Keith only sighed as he approached him. Why? He asked. You're wondering why I left? I get why you left, he replied. Why didn't you come back when Dad died? I could see her face falter a bit. I couldn't, she replied. Keith turned to her. You need to do better than I couldn't. Keith, I wanted to. When you were born, I was sent on a mission to another reality. By the time I came back, you'd been completely masked from us. I searched for you. I did. But whatever magic Hector used was powerful. Keith considered this for a moment. Well, maybe we can try to start over once this is all finished, he said softly. I could tell that this meant a great deal to the angel. I couldn't help but think about my parents. My mother had died when I was in my teens, leaving my dad alone to try and raise 3 kids. Things would have gone wrong if not for our grandfather, who retired just to help out. Things were difficult at first, but they got better, until we found our grandfather with his throat slit in our driveway. My father disappeared shortly after. I think he went after whoever did it, but I don't know. It was kind of why I jumped at the opportunity to join the CIA. I figured I could get some answers. But between the missions and meeting Ophelia, my side hobby took a backseat. I felt bad for Keith. I at least had memories of my parents to hold on to. He didn't, but maybe he could change that. It took us a bit, but we were eventually ready to go. Chad stood atop the first APC in our column. Aisha and Keith stood in front of it. Aisha was staring at the teleportation cubes in her hand. "Where did you get those?" asked Keith. "Rashad, you sure you want to go through with this?" she asked in response. Keith took a deep solemn breath. "That man used and lied to me my entire life. He has to die," Keith said. Aisha exhaled. "Okay then," she said as she tossed the cubes. They formed the corners of a yellow portal large enough for the APC to fit through. The APCs went through first, Chad standing on top of them. I followed with Ophelia, Keith, and Aisha. "I was beginning to think you were standing me up again," a voice asked from the front. "And miss all the action?" Chad replied. It was pouring down sheets of rain when we exited the portal. I was honestly just happy that I had the suit on. It was wet and cold. Ophelia turned and vomited as she exited the portal next to me. I could feel everyone staring at her. My HUD scanned her, but the readings all came back fine. "You good?" I asked. "I'm fine. Portal makes me nauseous." I took my helmet off as I approached Rachel. The rain was colder than I'd expected. All I could think about was finishing the greeting and getting it back on. Rachel looked at me and smiled slyly. "I heard you were dead," she said. "I was. It was boring as hell." She smirked. "So, what's the plan?" "We're gonna storm Gideon Lab." "That's bold. They have upped protection tenfold." "We've got people on that," I said. A bolt of lightning lit up the sky. The storm raging across the city was massive. I even spotted a tornado somewhere along the outskirts. I can remember groaning under my breath. The storm would make actual air support impossible. We made our way in the APCs to the target building. Rachel had brought a 12-man SAS team with her as well, so we didn't exactly have any elbow room. I was sitting next to Rachel, who had a tablet out that had a live feed from Taro's point of view. The video feed was coming from the man's glasses. It showed him walking into a room. Grace was tied to a chair with several IV units attached to her arms. They had been drawing her blood. Jackson stood over her.
"Your father was a bigger monster than any of us. Not bad for a human."
He sneered.
"Sir, Victor needs you."
Taro said.
"For what?"
Jackson asked as he turned around.
"Something about the terms of your deal. You need to go over there."
Jackson groaned before walking out past the Mercenary. Grace's eyes met the Mercenary. I could see a smile come across her face.
"That guy's an ass,"
Taro said as he pulled his mask off. Taro then started to unhook Grace.
"I owe you one. My God, you've lost a lot of blood. Do me a favor and don't go feral."
Taro said. "Feral?" I asked as I looked at Rachel.
It's what happens when a vampire doesn't have any blood for an extended period of time. They lose their self-control.
Horseman's voice said into my comlink.
What are you doing?
Asked another voice behind Terrell.
Boss wants removed.
Terrell said.
Hang on, I need to radio this in.
The mercenary said behind Terrell.
Okay, maybe go a little feral.
Terrell said as he stepped to the side. Grace moved in a blur of motion. Her mouth found itself attached to the mercenary's throat. Blood went everywhere as Terrell checked to make sure his pistol was loaded.
Better?
He asked.
So much.
Grace replied as she wiped the blood from her mouth.
Good, let's go.
Terrell replied. By then, my suit had hijacked their feet. I could see it in the corner of my hut. It was a good way to keep up with their location. Our angelic friends had arrived and started a shitstorm at the front gate. They were now free to engage humans. That was what their meeting had been about, which meant there were no guards patrolling the 10-foot-high concrete wall around the rest of the facility. I exited the APC and jumped over the wall. It was clear. All the fighting was in the front. I'm going to cut the power. Ophelia, take a squad and finish securing the front. Aisha, take a squad and clear the sub-level labs. Ray, you and Miguel go and find Grace. With that, I was back on my own. I made my way through a window. Inside the facility, the alarms were already going off thanks to the angels up front. I needed to make my way up to the roof and to the building's generator to kill the power. The building was only around 7 stories tall, so it wouldn't be a long trip up the stairs. I made my way towards the stairs, my hut showing me the feeds from several Navy SEALs GoPros. One feed showed a SEAL following Chad and Rachel as they followed Ophelia.
You know we're still technically married, right?
Rachel asked.
I gave you the divorce paperwork? You never showed up to court.
Rachel said.
I got a little busy, okay?
Replied Chad.
Doing what?
She asked.
You're a spy. You probably already know. Okay, fine. I did miss you though.
Rachel said. Chad exhaled.
I missed you too.
The hut cut to a SEAL that was following Keith and Aisha.
They know we're here.
Keith said as he raised what looked like Rashad's old energy blaster.
Good.
Aisha replied, blowing up a nearby security camera. Can you get into the security system? I asked the horseman through comms as I found the stairs.
I'm trying, but the system seems to have been warded to some degree.
How the hell does that work? I asked.
Trent, I could spend 2 months trying to explain it.
I rolled my eyes as I started to ascend the stairs. The feet with Keith and Aisha showed them in the lab area, which was completely empty. It was barren almost. No equipment, no people, nothing aside from the glass walls.
Why is it so empty?
Keith asked.
I don't know,
replied Aisha. That was when there was a flash of lightning ahead of them. The SEAL whose POV I was watching adjusted his aim as Raiden exited the flash. Little light bender, he said right before lifting his hand. A bolt of lightning suddenly zapped the SEAL, who fell down dead. His camera now aimed at Keith, who was approached by Morales, who had his hands in his pockets. After all this time, you finally know the truth. We don't need to be enemies. Keith readied himself for a fight, aiming his blaster at Hector. Yes, we do. Keith fired a white beam of energy at Morales. But Morales was faster than expected, dodging the blast and kicking the blaster from his hands. Keith staggered back a step or two before yanking the sword from his back. You were like a father to me, but it was all fake. You used me, Keith barked. Morales had his hands up. Come on, Keith, let's not make this difficult. Keith ignored that and took a shot at Morales. The sword missed by maybe an inch before Morales morphed again into a snake form, opening its giant maw and trying to eat Keith whole. Keith was fast though, slashing the beast's eye with his blade, causing the snake to morph back into Hector, who was holding his now bloody eye. "You ungrateful little shit. I should have killed you like I did your father." Keith replied to this by cutting Hector's head from his shoulders, the head bouncing across the floor toward the camera. I couldn't see much else. I kind of figured that Aisha had engaged Raiden. "Hey!" I heard Keith shout. Then I could see a flash behind the head. That was when I'd made it to the roof of the facility. The rain was still falling hard. I was looking up at a neon blue Gideon sign. I sighed. The generator was right underneath it. My HUD locked onto it, and I hit the EMP button on my wrist, sending an aimed electromagnetic pulse at it. The sign suddenly went out. "Power's out," I said.
"Raiden to Keith,"
Aisha's voice said over the comlink. My HUD feed cut to another SEAL who was standing near Ophelia, Raziel, and Rain. Rain looked very distressed, her wings spread out wide. "Shit," she bellowed. "Rain, don't," Raziel warned. But it was too late. Rain was skyward. My HUD feed shifted back to Terrell, who had come to a stop in the hallway, his weapon aimed at a figure standing in front of him. A thin man with 2 thin daggers. "Shit," Terrell said. "Hello, girl," Jackson replied as Grace stepped past Terrell. "I don't have any silver ammunition," Terrell said. It got quiet for a moment. Grace didn't take her eyes off of Jackson. I could tell what she was thinking. She only confirmed it with her next line. "Don't worry about that. I'm gonna rip his fucking head off." Grace charged at Jackson in a blur, decking him in the face hard. Jackson responded by trying to stab Grace, but Grace dodged it and tried to punch him again. But he was ready this time, his knife ending up in her wrist. Grace took a sharp breath. Jackson tried to stab her with his other dagger, this one aimed for the throat. But Grace caught him below the wrist. Terrell raised his pistol. That was when a gunshot rang out. A bullet sailed through the side of Jackson's head, causing it to snap to one side. But his wound healed almost instantaneously. He straightened back up and looked at Grace. "Normal bullets won't kill me," he growled. What Jackson hadn't realized though is that when he had been shot in the side of his head, he'd let go of the dagger that wasn't in Grace's wrist. Grace had caught it, then shoved it into his throat. "No, this will," Grace growled as she used the knife to slowly cut Jackson's head off, before kicking his body to the floor. "Oh God," Terrell yelped. Grace dropped the head onto the floor and raised her foot before bringing it down hard on the severed head, turning it to mush. "Remind me to never piss you off," Terrell said. I made my way to the edge of the roof now, trying to look through the sheets of rain for Rain. I eventually found her as she landed across from a figure. My HUD zoomed in on it. Victor, with Keith out at his feet. I couldn't hear what was said. Thunder boomed as lightning crackled through the sky. I could hear movement behind me, but based on their erratic breathing and heart rate, it isn't what I was worried about at the moment.
"We found Victor,"
Raziel's voice said on comms. Aeolaer and Raziel landed next to Rain. There was more dialogue that I couldn't hear. Victor was in full armor. He wielded a glowing white sword and silver-colored shield. Aeolaer charged in first, trying to swipe at Victor with his glowing twin hooks. Victor cut the angel in half in an instant, while blocking a blow from Rain's glaive with his shield. They fought for a few seconds, moving away from Keith as he started to come to. He managed to pick up his sword right as Victor disarmed Rain and took her hostage. There was a standoff. Victor's sword was at Rain's throat. Raziel and Keith standing their ground. More talking. Keith dropped his sword. Victor smiles. Then, his sword suddenly explodes from Rain's chest. Keith screams so loud that I can hear it from my rooftop, almost a mile away. Victor vanishes. leaving Keith holding Rain as she dies.
Victor's gone. Aeolaer and Rain are down. I've got Keith,
Raziel said into comms. So, this is what they turned you into. Seems a bit generic. A voice said from behind me. A voice that made my blood boil. I was wondering where you were, I said as I turned to Jamie. Why, you in a hurry to die again? He asked. Victor brought you back. He didn't give you a single weapon to kill me with. I could hear his heart rate. My HUD could see his heart. It was beating so hard, it could power a small car. I could also see it in his eyes. The man looked like he was about to cry. I don't think you're here to kill me, I said. You don't know why I'm here. You don't know shit about me, he growled. If you wanted to kill me, you'd have done it 30 seconds ago. You said it yourself. You wanted to make a better world. How does a genocide accomplish that? I asked. I could see him stammer a bit. He took a breath. I didn't think it. Did he release the weapon? I asked. Jamie's eyes went straight to the ground. He did. You can't beat him. He's where? I asked. The other building. I was done with the conversation. I stepped forward and tacked Jamie in the side of the head, knocking him out cold. Victor's released the weapon. We need to get a move on before the infected hit the streets.
About that,
Raziel's voice called into comms. I stood up and looked out at the other building. Raziel was standing at the edge of the roof, looking down over a set of 4 open garage doors, where they were pouring out. We would eventually call these variants Lazarus crawlers. They started out human, yes, but they'd mutated. The pathogen caused their blood to boil. Their spines elongated and morphed until they had spikes protruding from the center of their backs and through their clothing. Their arms had become elongated to twice their normal length. Bone claws had exploded from the tips of their fingers as well. Their mouths were unhinged like that of a snake's, if the snakes had massive jagged teeth. They ran around on all fours, screeching loudly as they did so. I gritted my teeth. Things just got even worse. I took a deep breath as I heard Jamie start to move behind me. I turned and knelt over him. He wasn't awake. Not yet. I should kill you, I said. But I think there's potential for some good here, even if you don't know it. The horseman appeared behind me. A week ago, you'd have cut his head off, he said. I know. What changed? I'm just trying to be what I was meant to be. And what's that? I turned and looked at him with a smirk. It was like I said earlier. The world didn't need any more survivors. It needed people to do the right thing. One of the good guys, I said. A few moments later, Jamie was being escorted into a stairwell by 2 SEALs while I stood there with Ophelia. The infected had already attacked most of the buildings surrounding the one they exited. Why didn't Terrell tell us about the second building? I asked. Rachel says he didn't know. It was a Gideon top brass only, she replied. I looked back out at the city. We can't let them take the city, I said. She shrugged. Our air transport is useless until we do something about this storm. We need to distract the infected until we can get airborne. And how do we do that? Ophelia asked. I looked at the unlit Gideon sign. I could feel her staring at me. I've got one idea. And the storm? That was when Aisha came marching through the doorway. We need to find Raiden, she growled. That would have to wait. We needed to get the attention of the crawlers. The first step was turning on the power and getting the lights back on. Then the SEALs in chat would deploy flares onto the road just ahead of the front wall. The APCs parked just outside the walls, as their miniguns would be detrimental to holding back the horde. I was heading downstairs when the SEALs deployed the flares. I could see the whole thing through Angel's GoPro. The light bathed the surrounding area in a red tint. It also revealed several crawlers who were already making their way towards the wall. All hell broke loose. The infected screeched in unison as they charged. Everyone on the walls opened fire. The APCs opened up with their miniguns. I booked it down the stairwell. We made it out into the courtyard to a symphony of gunfire. The walls surrounding the facility were 10 feet tall and made from concrete. They had wooden platforms lined up right next to them so GSF could use the wall as cover. I jumped onto a platform right between Chad and Rachel, just in time for the gunfire to stop. The street ahead of me was littered in blood and body parts. But I knew that we hadn't won yet. "What's going on?" I asked. "They went into the buildings," replied Chad. We all knew what was happening. The infected were more intelligent than we'd expected, but not by much. "They're planning their next move," I said. "What should we do?" asked Chad. "The same." My HUD pulled up the feed from Terrell's glasses, where Terrell and Grace had found Miguel and Ray standing in the armory. Miguel was looking up at all the guns on the walls in awe.
"It's like a Texan Christmas,"
he exclaimed. Ray turned and looked at Grace, then froze in surprise.
"Wait, I know you,"
Grace said.
"Grace?"
Ray asked.
"Yeah, I don't know your name."
Grace replied.
"Who is this?"
Terrell asked.
"I'm Agent Ray Bussey, CIA." "Ew,"
Terrell said. That was when blinding flashes accompanied several lightning bolts that slammed into several parts of the wall as well as 2 of the APCs. I was sent careening through the air and into the mud behind me. I was quickly on my feet and helping Ophelia up to hers, a massive hole in the wall behind us. I looked around the courtyard. There were several down seals. Chad was on his feet. Rachel had her weapon aimed in my direction. My eyes went wide. That was when I realized she was aiming behind me. I turned to see a crawler charging into the hole, one that Rachel shot dead in its tracks. However, 6 more took its place. "Get everyone inside the building," I shouted at Ophelia. I drew my sword and went to work. I could see Aisha was doing the same with her spear. In the corner of my hut, I could see Angel's feet again. He had landed outside of the wall. One leg had been blown off. He had his pistol raised at one of the crawlers as it charged him. To his credit, he killed it. But several more were suddenly upon him. His screams were loud. I could hear them from my position. The crawlers were far more dangerous than their revenant counterparts. That was easy to see. Aisha and I held our ground while everyone else got inside. I cut several down as I found myself fighting backwards. Aisha and I were the last 2 in the courtyard now. I knew I had an advantage that she didn't. I had armor. "Get inside," I commanded. The door in the courtyard was one you'd expect to see in a bomb shelter, a large metallic sliding door that Aisha barely managed to slide under before it closed. I was out in the courtyard by myself now. I cut down several more crawlers, but there were so many of them. One even tried to bite my shoulder blade, only for its teeth to shatter on my armor. It wasn't much longer before I found myself under a dog pile. Then, just as suddenly, I was teleported into a hallway, the horseman standing over me with Ophelia and Chad beside him. "What now?" I asked as Chad helped me up. "The infected will undoubtedly attempt to gain entry. Luckily for you, this place is on lockdown. I recommend you take Aisha to the other building, link up with Raziel and Keith, and find Raiden." A few moments later, the horseman had teleported Aisha and I to a nearby rooftop, right in front of Keith and a kneeling Raziel. "Well, that was convenient," Keith said. "Raiden took out the walls. We need to..." A bolt of lightning interrupted me as it hit the roof not 10 feet from our position. We found ourselves staring Raiden in the face. He was a lot bigger than I thought. "Huh?" Keith said. "This is awkward," I said. I could see Raiden's shoulders semi-slump. "Shit," he growled. "Wrong rooftop?" I asked. "Yeah," he said as he readied his club. Another bolt of lightning came whistling down toward him, but it dissipated before I could reach him. "Trying to teleport away?" I asked. "Yeah." "Not working?" "No." The horseman looked over at Raziel. "Go and find Victor. The kids will take care of this one." I can remember laughing at that. I still wasn't used to being referred to as a kid. For all this talk about Raiden being a rogue god, I honestly expected him to put up more of a fight. The exchange was quick. We attacked. He tried to whack me with his club. I dodged it and slashed one of his leg with my sword. Aisha went airborne. Keith waited for an opening. Aisha's spear ended up in Raiden's shoulder. Keith found his opening when he stabbed Raiden through his knee. I'd found myself behind the red giant. I vaulted myself into the air and brought my foot down hard onto the back of his head. Raiden fell face first onto the rooftop. The rain suddenly stopped, and the moonlight shone through the clouds. I stood with Aisha and Keith. "That was surprisingly easy," I said. "Shall we kill him?" "I want to kill him," answered Aisha. "Not yet," Keith said. "I still need him to find Lucy."
This is Director Jones. Air support is inbound. I repeat, air support is inbound.
A voice sounded off on our comlink. I breathed a massive sigh of relief as I turned to look at the Gideon lab, only to see the building covered in infected. And when I say covered, I mean they scaled the front of the building like ants, scattering up the walls and looking for an opening. As mentioned earlier, the building was in lockdown, which meant the windows had all steel covers over them. It didn't take long for the air support to show up, a pack of small Littlebird helicopters along with some Blackhawks.
"We're approaching. We can't extract until you clear the infected off the building."
"Ah, shit," I mumbled under my breath.
"I may have an idea for that,"
Ophelia's voice said onto comms. My mind pondered what her idea was. That question was answered when the doorway to the building slowly started to open. The infected didn't waste any time forcing their way inside, but that may have been a poor choice on their part. The doorway opened the rest of the way, revealing a black Abrams tank with Chad sitting on the machine gun turret. Chad opened fire on the infected, turning several of them to red slush before going back down and closing the tank hatch. The tank was swarmed almost instantly as it slowly inched its way out of the building. The doorway closed behind it. The tank slowly inched its way out of the courtyard. The infected followed it out. Ophelia had basically used the tank as bait to lure the infected away from the building. "Ophelia?" I asked on the comlink.
"Yes?"
"Where'd you guys get the tank?" I asked.
"The bait is working. I'll get you guys on the roof,"
Joan said. I looked up at the choppers, just as one of the Blackhawks was slammed into by a rocket.
"Where'd that come from?"
asked Jones over comms. The Black Hawk suddenly spun out until it collided with the side of the building. I could see Terrell's video feed in the corner of my hut. He, Grace, and Ray were on the stairwell shooting down at several crawlers that had been coming up at them. Shit, I thought to myself. Another rocket came flying in towards the little bird, which barely dodged it. The chopper turned, and the gunner opened fire on the culprit. My hut zoomed in on them, revealing Carlos Estevez sprinting across a rooftop with a rocket launcher in his arms. A Blackhawk landed on the rooftop of the Gideon lab. It began picking up our guys, starting with Jamie and a few soldiers. Grace, Terrell, and Ray had weapons aimed at the doorway as something was slamming into it. They loaded up onto the chopper, and it went airborne. My eyes went back down to the tank, which was still being swarmed. It looked like a bunch of ants going after a picnic. The tank started moving as the chopper lowered itself. It was one of the little birds, one with Jones piloting and Juan Estevez on the machine gun. Juan opened up on the infected crowding the tank, peeling them off as the tank started to pick up speed. The rest of the infected started to give chase, It took a second, but most of the infected were chasing the tank down a long stretch of road. No more infected were on the tank, but there had to have been hundreds running behind it, all lined up for the choppers. The chopper launched a slew of missiles and machine gun fire into the horde. Explosions rocked the street behind the chopper.
Raziel has engaged Victor underneath you,
the horseman said into the comlink. The three of us on the roof took off, going inside the building below us through a small doorway. We found ourselves in a hallway running at full speed. Victor stood with his back to us at a massive hole in the wall that looked to be about the size of Raziel. He watched the choppers as they gunned down the creatures.
"No!"
he growled as he went skyward out from the hole.
"Victor's outside,"
Jones called out. We made it through the hole just in time to see the former general of Heaven's armies surrounded by helicopters.
"We have you surrounded. Drop your weapons, or we'll open fire."
Jones's voice boomed from a little bird speaker. The angel didn't reply, moving in a blur of motion and ramming himself through one of the choppers before chopping another's tail off with his sword. He turned to the little bird that Jones and Juan were in. Both were watching in horror. There was a loud bang, then something hit Victor hard, leaving a cloud of smoke where Victor had been flying. A cloud that a pissed-off Victor emerged from, his eyes locking on the instigator, the black tank below. He started to speak, but something else hit him from behind. This caused him to go careening down into the mud below. Raziel had grabbed him and caused them both to crash into the ground below. The two didn't waste any time engaging again. I jumped from the hole and landed in the mud below, just in time to see the infected that were left suddenly attacking the tank again. "Tell me you guys are not in that tank," I said into the comlink.
"Cry about it,"
Ophelia's voice replied. I groaned as I changed course from the angels to the tank. "I'll take the tank then. You two help Raziel." I raced to the tank. There were only 5 or 6 infected on it. I cut them down relatively quickly before getting to the hatch. Chad was looking up at me. "What's up, Trent?" he asked. "Oh, you know, stuff," I replied as I turned my head to check on the status of our allies. Victor had sidestepped one of Keith's blows and kicked him into the mud. Raziel and Aisha were recovering. "Ophelia, hit the gas," I said. Ophelia did as asked, or maybe it was Miguel. I don't know who was driving and who was on the gun. The tank went sailing towards Victor. As we approached, I could hear Victor bellow. "You can't beat me, even with the top half of Lucifer's sword. You're too hurt." He was cut off when the tank suddenly collided with him. The tank hit him hard, but we all knew that wouldn't last long. I helped Ophelia, Chad, and Miguel out from the tank before jumping off myself. I was barely off when the tank flipped over, revealing a very pissed off Victor. His wings spread wide and his face full of wild rage and his eyes on me. "Can't you see that I've already won? The weapon is made. It's distributing as we speak." I straightened up as I readied my sword. Everyone was up and ready to go now. I was flanked on either side by Ophelia, Chad, Miguel, Aisha and Keith. Raziel was on his feet as well. The choppers surrounded us with their weapons aimed at him. Victor was powerful, yes. He could put up a fight, maybe even kill all of us. But we didn't care at that point. This was ending, now. "Shut up and fight," I growled. Victor chuckled madly. "You think I'm afraid? Of you? Of death? Look at you all, so angry, so wrathful. All killing me will do is prove my point about you." "Not afraid of death, are you?" Horseman asked as he suddenly appeared behind Victor. Victor's face went white as paper. For a moment, he looked horrified. Victor didn't get another word out before Horseman ripped his wings from his back. "I'm afraid this little game is over," Horseman said as he tossed his wings into the mud. Victor dropped to his knees. "You can't kill me. It's against the rules," he stammered out. The Horseman smirked. Victor, Victor, Victor. I only disabled you. The honor of killing you doesn't belong to me. Keith stepped forward, his blade burning white hot. The top half of Lucifer's blade, huh? It's fitting that I send you to hell with it. Anger seemed to flash across Victor's face as he started to yell. Hell doesn't scare me. You don't. Keith shoved the sword straight into Victor's throat. Stop talking, Keith roared. I had a good chuckle at that. They always want to talk, don't they? I said to myself as Victor's body plopped to the ground. It didn't hit me until a few hours later, just the magnitude of everything that just happened. Dead or not, Victor had completed the weapon. He'd already distributed it, which meant the world had just changed in a major way. He may have just set off a timer that would count down to doomsday. Only we could stop it. Hopefully. During the cleanup of what we would one day refer to as the Battle of Grozny, a lot actually happened. For one, Jamie and Raiden were both transported to a secret black site prison where they'd be spending the foreseeable future. For two, Jones approached me with an offer. He wanted to reopen Shaw's old unit, but under a different name. He wanted me to be its head. I told him that I'd think about it, of course, saying that there'd be some terms, like I'd pick my own team, that and the CIA would have no say in it whatsoever. He surprisingly agreed to it, but did inform me that he already offered the Lightbenders a place. Aisha declined, but Keith did not. I had a lot to think about. I'd have recruited them anyways. I also wanted to recruit Grace. Her father was part of Shaw's old team, plus he had trained her. I also knew that I'd need Chad and Ophelia's team. But there was something about that thought that made me hesitate, which was something the Horseman picked up on as we stood outside one of the Red Cross outreach tents. She acquitted herself admirably, he said. She did, but I know what we're up against. And you worry for her safety because you love her, he asked. I do, I replied. The Horseman sighed, almost longingly. I was in love once. It can be the hardest thing in the world. Tragedy is often unavoidable. Who was she? I asked. She was another horseman like myself. She put herself in danger and was killed. I told her not to come with me, but she was impossible to say no to. I'm sorry, I said. If I could go back and save her, I would. But I know that no matter what I do, she'd always insist on coming with me. What happened with her was unavoidable, and I miss her every day. But nevertheless, he trailed off. What are you trying to say? I asked. Ophelia is strong-willed. She won't take no for an answer. If you spend your time pushing her away to protect her, you won't get that time back. I thought about this for a minute. The Horseman had a point. A good one at that. Ophelia was stubborn. If I tried to keep her away, she'd find another way in regardless. Then I'd have wasted the time I spent pushing her out. I turned and walked into the supply tent, only to come to a grinding halt as I stared one of our loose ends in the face. Carlos Esteves had one arm wrapped around Ophelia's throat, while the other had a knife that was soaked in her blood. She'd come in for water, and had gotten stabbed for it. I was in shock. I stood there dumbfounded for a second. She was alive, but weak. Ophelia? I asked. Mr. Grayson, I'm so glad you could make it, Carlos said with a psychotic grin that stretched ear to ear. I gathered my senses and pulled my pistol, trying desperately to get a shot on him. He seemed to shrink behind her. Ophelia, are you okay? I asked. She's not okay, Mr. Grayson. She's been stabbed. I can't tell you how long I've been waiting for this moment. All of us together again. Trent? Ophelia stammered. That was when the Horseman appeared in the corner of the room. Carlos hadn't been expecting this. "Oh, hello," Horseman said. "Huh?" Carlos asked. That was when Ophelia's eyes met mine. I knew exactly what she was about to do. She used whatever strength she had left to push the knife away from her neck and move her head to one side. It wasn't much, maybe a few inches, but that was child's play. I fired my 1911 once, and Carlos Estevez's brain splattered across the back of the tent. Ophelia fell forward, and I caught her. The next few hours were a blur. Medics came and got her. She was transported to a hospital in a nearby city and stabilized. She was lucky. Carlos had missed most of her vital organs. Once stabilized, she was transported to a facility in the States. She would live, of course. During the 36 hours of dealing with her stab wound and transportation, Chad and I made it official with Jones. We were to set start to this new unit. Grace and Keith had accepted our invitations, and the Reagan was to be our home for the foreseeable future. This would all be off the books, of course. It's hard to properly describe the logistics of how that all works. The next time I spoke with Ophelia again, she was sitting in a hospital bed watching the news. It was that random onion channel again, the same one that Horseman had played. I honestly wasn't a big fan of their stuff, especially after they interviewed a drunk redneck that went by Ron Skittle about a gator man that tried sleeping with his wife. Their headline today read, "Superstorm in Grozny, Gideon CEO dead." The story went like this. A massive superstorm hit the city of Grozny out of nowhere. The brave and virtuous Victor Marks happened to be in town overseeing repairs to one of the facilities damaged by the riots we'd caused a few weeks prior. He led hundreds of people to take shelter from the storm in one of the facilities. Unfortunately, the facility collapsed, killing him. I couldn't believe the shit I was watching. These guys were actually going to make this guy out to be a goddamn hero. It made my blood boil. But there wasn't much I could do at that moment. They also had a Gideon rep on. Their newest CEO. A man with black, slick-back hair and a thin mustache. A man whose mere presence gave me a weird sense of anxiety. They called him Adrian Stein. I knew just by looking at him that one day we were going to cross paths. But that would have to wait. "I take it you've seen the news?" Ophelia said from her hospital bed. "Unfortunately, shit's been on all day. How are you feeling?" I replied. She smiled softly at me. "The pain mats in here suck. Other than that, I'm fine." She looked at me for a second. Even in her pale, weakened state, she seemed to glow. "We gonna talk about things yet?" she asked. I took her hand and smiled. "Soon. You need a reason to get out of that bed," I said. She was just about to protest when Chad walked in. "Hey, I don't mean to interrupt, but you have a phone call," Chad said. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and took a deep breath as I read the contact. It said, "Ellen Jones." I put it to my ear. "This is Grayson," I said.
"Moria Tippes just surfaced in Rome. I'm sending you the information."
I pulled the phone away as it buzzed with a text message. "Got it," I said before hanging up. I turned back to Ophelia. "We gotta go," I said softly. She sighed and crossed her arms. "I know, we can't risk her having a Lazarus canister." "I promise we'll talk," I said. She only smirked. "I know." With that, I walked outside of the hospital room, my phone in one hand. Chad walked out behind me. We had a job to get started on. And our next adventure would only add to the craziness that was Earth Prime. But that's a different story for another time.